Hey guys, welcome back to Threes and Blitz. And today we're going to be talking about the Los Angeles Clippers and this whole, Kawhi Leonard situation. Obviously, reports and rumors are, saying Kawhi Leonard, is getting paid $24 million under the table through, a company that Steve Ballmer owns. And that company filed for bankruptcy and investigated reporters, kind of found connections between everything. And everything is speculation because nothing has came out and says, yes, this actually happened. I know, Steve Ballmer kind of came on, ESPN and said a couple like, hey, I had no idea. And, if I would have known this, I would have not, signed him. And, they kind of conned me. But I really think he knew. And he's kind of playing that, well, I don't know. I don't do all that. I'm just the owner. But at the end of the day, when you're the owner to anything, if you're an owner to a house, a car, or, $1 billion basketball team, what is happening. So I'm curious of what the consequences are going to be because we saw something similar to this in the early 2000s with the Timberwolves and Joe Smith. He signed that friend team friendly deal, and everyone was like, wow, we expected more money, and that kind of scratched people's heads. And then they started digging in and finding evidence of this illegal paid under the table, and they paid for it because this handicapped the Timberwolves because they took five future first round picks and basically said you can't build around Kevin Garnett, and this is your consequence because you're gonna have to trade him. And that's what happened. I could just compare a Kevin Garnett to a Giannis. Imagine if Giannis didn't have this supporting cast when they won a championship. Obviously now he does not have this supporting cast, but imagine like throughout 5 years ago, 5 straight years, he does not have any supporting cast. He leads the league and points, rebounds. He's the defensive player of the year, kind of like what he is actually now. But just imagine he just never made it to the finals. He would never really make it to the playoffs, and if he did, he would get swept by these the San Antonio Spurs, the Lakers, because he just didn't have the help. And with the Clippers, they just don't have future first round picks because you traded everything for Paul George. And what makes it worse is that the Thunder, they won the championship. They have an MVP who just came off that championship run, and then they still have your future first round pick. So I'm curious of what the consequences are going to be because I do think they're going to be found guilty with this. This is just not a coincidence that it just magically came out, and I'm curious of what Adam Silver is going to do because with David Stern, we knew what he was going to do. He was going to drop the hammer because he did it with the Timberwolves, and he did it with other things too. Going out too much, violence off the court, on the court. He would fine them, suspend them, or ban them, which is crazy to think about. But he had most players and coaches and check with that. And with Adam Silver, he's more of a players type of guy. He gives them more free will. But I think with this situation, he needs to, put his, foot down and say, this is not okay. And this is the consequence. Because if you find Steve Ballmer, he's worth over $100 billion. You find him, even 20 million, $50 million, that's nothing to him because he's a billionaire and he doesn't care about spending money. We saw it. He built his new stadium. He doesn't care about going over the salary cap in the, first apron, maybe the second apron, but he doesn't really care and it doesn't really affect him because at the end of the day, he's a passionate about, the Clippers. He's a passionate NBA, owner, which, I respect. But at the same time, you are going to have to punish this. Is it him forcing to sell the team? I really hope not because there's not a lot of owners that, you genuinely see and say, wow, that guy actually cares about, at least the fans more. He built the stadium and said, hey, let's build this jumbo screen all across so, even the fans in the nosebleed can see. Let's build some chargers, faster Wi-Fi, cheaper tickets. Let's build this fan wall, because, I like the college atmosphere better than the NBA. And NBA, it's kind of you just sit there. We want fans on their feet cheering, and I just think that's cool of a owner to actually sit there and think like, hey, how can I make this more of a fun and better experience? But at the same time, he did know about this, and for him to say, well, I didn't know, it's kind of, I don't believe it. I don't think anyone believes it because you're the owner. If you own a house, own a car, own anything, and if something happens, 99% of the time, like, oh wow, yeah, I know my, tires are flat. I know my, stickers expired in my car, and you get pulled over. You can't just be like, yeah, I don't know. I'm sorry. An alternative punishment I think that is better is suspending Kawhi Leonard for the whole season, including the playoff. And I say that because if you suspend him just for the regular season, it really doesn't affect him as much because he takes that load management and his recovery on his body. And yes, you could bring him back for the playoffs and he could be super rusty because it does take a sample size, 16, 25 games to get your, feet under and feel the game in the NBA because these are the best players in the world playing basketball. But at the same time, it really wouldn't feel like a punishment. Of course, you find the organization, but again, Steve Baldwin could make up this money, 20 million or whatever you're going to find him in, a day, 2 days. It doesn't matter because they're billionaires and he has so many resources that he can make up this money and their future, yes, you could take their 27, 28, 29, future, first round picks, but at the same time, they kind of already gave up their future and said, hey, this is our future right here. We care about the present. We don't really care what happens, 4 or 5 years from now. And they've shown that, that's why they gave up all those picks for Paul George and gave up SGA and all their young players. This team is a veteran team. It doesn't really have any young players in the rotation. And another punishment that I think that needs to happen is to ban, Uncle Dennis and Kawhi Leonard's team and anyone in the Clippers organization that knew about this, shadiness. Because if you're not putting your foot down, Adam Silver, that these teams around the league are like, wow, I thought about doing this, but I just didn't know because the only example we had was, the Timberwolves in the early 2000s and they kind of handicapped their future. But now looking at the Clippers, years later, it wasn't really that bad of a punishment. They only took, 2 first round picks and they fined them, maybe $10 million. But that really wasn't anything because they had a deep playoff run. They probably made up that money. It doesn't really feel like Adam Silver is going to do anything, but I really hope I'm wrong. I hope he, one, suspends Kawhi Leonard for the whole, season, including the playoff, bans, Uncle Dennis and his team from any type of negotiation, any type of trade request, anything, as long as Kawhi Leonard's in the NBA. And any Clippers, personnels that knew about this, maybe even, ban, Steve Ballmer for the season, including the playoffs too, just because, he's the owner. I think he most likely knew about this. And I think at the end of the day, if there's not severe consequences, that this is going to happen more often than we see. I know it probably happens more, but I just feel like if the NBA doesn't act on it, this is going to end up like, how baseball is. And with baseball, there's no salary cap. They kind of just pay the most to, star players or, good role players because they don't have a salary cap. And that's why all these big organizations and big markets, like, the Dodgers, the Yankees, even the Astros, that's why these teams are always, so good because they just throw out money to the best players and the best fit. And they don't really, develop and draft really as well as they should. And I really hope the NBA doesn't, fall in that category because, this finals that we watched with, the Pacers and Thunder, I love two small markets going at it. And it was really good, a game 7. Unfortunately, an injury happened to Tyrese, but, that was a good series. And a lot of people were, talking mess about it because it was two very small markets. But if you looked at them, the Thunder, they drafted and traded well. And if you look at the other side too, the Pacers, they drafted, developed, and traded well. And it was just really cool seeing these two markets and not these big names, bouncing around from team to team. I'm not throwing any shade, but it was really nice seeing that finally. I feel like we just haven't seen that in a while. I know we saw it with the Nuggets when they won it, and even, the Celtics, but at the same time, it just, those were kind of bigger names and bigger markets. It just was really nice seeing that. I just feel like Adam Silver is not going to put his foot down, but I hope I'm wrong. Let me know in the comments below. Thanks for listening. Thanks for watching. And yeah.